Oh, that this too solid flesh would melt, thaw, and resolve itself into a dew. Or that the everlasting had upturned his cannon against self-slaughtered gods. Gods, how weary, stale, flat, and unprofitable seems all the working of the world to me. 'Tis an unweeded garden that grows to seed. Things rank and gross abuse it merely.
Welcome to the Redcaps Podcast, a podcast where we dip our caps into the blood of our listeners and we ramble on about old school games. In the world of OSR, the blog is often considered the cradle of innovation, and no blog in recent time has been of more influence than that of the Alexandrian. Justin Alexander was kind enough to take some time from his busy schedule and sit down and have a chat with little old me, and I think the results were pretty entertaining. So, since no mortal can outrun a Redcap, I hope you can simply sit back, listen, and enjoy the conversation. All right, everybody. I am joined by actor, blogger, YouTuber, Emmy Award winner, game designer, playwright. Is there any other, adjectives I should be putting before your name? Justin Alexander, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. I guess you could add like best father of the year to that, just for kidding.
Man, your mug must run out of space whenever they try to put all that stuff on the mug for you.
It's more of like a stein, really, that you have to like wrap it around to get all that in there. You're very kind to me. Thank you so much.
No problem. For folks who don't know the name Justin Alexander, you almost definitely know the name of the Alexandrian OSR blog that I think if you have not been reading it, you need to be. There's so much amazing content there. It's a kind of a treasure trove of tips for GMs. If you had to kind of, elevator pitch the blog in just a small couple of sentences, what would you say it is from your standpoint? Because it has changed over time, right? It started out as other things. It
has, yeah. So the Alexandrian started out as just kind of a personal repository of, it was a place for me to go online and kind of archive stuff that didn't have a place to live. The real impetus was actually, there was a review, an RPG review I wrote years ago in the late 90s for a game called Immortal, which is a glorious mess of a terrible but also kind of awesome game. And then when I wrote this review, I actually did a breakdown of like, boy, they do a really bad job of explaining the game, but here's how like the world is supposed to work. And a lot of people who ended up playing the game found that very useful, but for various reasons that review got taken down. And for several years, people would email me and be like, is there any place I can find your review of Immortal? And I eventually was like, I need to just start a website so I can dump some of this like stuff that is no longer available out there. So there's like a lot of reviews that I had done, a lot of articles I'd written for various magazines, RPG magazines back in the day. And so in the early days, it was just kind of like a hodgepodge of stuff. What it has evolved into, I think, more than anything else, is a place where I try to share my passion for game mastering and to give the tools, particularly for people who are already game masters, to take that next step and become what I think of as like advanced game masters. There's some material on there that's really good about like, here's how you can become a GM for the first time. But I think if you were talking about like what the core of the Alexandrian is about advanced game mastering tips and really kind of like taking it to the next level. Yeah, there's been, I don't know how many times I've gone back to reference things on hex crawls or your recent point crawl articles and stuff like that. Or sorry, not the depth crawl articles, what I meant to say, not point crawl. I had a point crawl article recently as well. So you were right both times. And yeah, just a lot of really good stuff in there. If I challenged you to say, hey, can you give me a single tip for a GM, new or old, and a player? Because I think the players often miss out on some of GMs. We like to talk to each other about stuff, but I think there's often a time where the player gets missed a little bit too. What would your single tip for a player or for a GM be? If there was one golden rule that isn't the obvious golden rule. Well, I think if I was going to give one tip for everybody at the table, it would be know the rules. And and also part of knowing the rules is being willing and able to rely on the expertise of other people at the table. There's this concept like the rules lawyer that kind of gets a bad rap. And when I think of a rules lawyer specifically, I think of someone who's trying to twist the rules for their own gain. Rules expertise is something else, and it's something that the table can share collectively. The GM can really benefit from being like, hey, can you look this thing up for me? Or, hey, I know you know a lot about this section of the rules or the setting even. Can you tell me about it? Can you help us out here? And the same thing works for players as well. So everyone being at the table working to master and have expertise in the rules will help everyone at the table kind of have a nice, smooth experience. But if I had to give one specific tip to like a player specifically, the tip I have for players is tell the GM what you want. Doesn't mean you'll always get it, but if you just tell the GM what you want, there is nothing more valuable to me as a GM than knowing that piece of information, and nothing that's more reliably going to make everybody at the table more likely to have a happy outcome than that one piece of clear communication. If you do nothing else, do that much, and also get me pizza.
Yeah, I think that the first one there, where you're talking about everybody knowing the rules to a point of, the rules lawyer, I think definitely gets the smack on it because of people trying to find the loopholes, the people trying to win the game. Is where I see that. But yeah, I think having especially if you're new to a system and some of the players have played it before, being open to having somebody look up stuff in a book or correct you, as long as it's not a case of every 3 seconds you're stopping a game, but doing it in a way that's constructive to the event, I think is definitely good that way. Do you find, are you a person who's more of if you don't know something, you'll kind of hand wave it through the game, or are you I need to know the rule and go that way?
I tend to default a bit more heavily towards, if I don't know something, I'm going to look it up and try and get it right. But my general rule of thumb is that if I'm spending more than about 20 to 30 seconds trying to find the rule, then I'm just going to make a ruling. And I'll be open about it. I can't find it right now. This is what we're going to do right now. We'll look it up and get it right next time. Or maybe we'll look it up and be like, well, that's terrible. Our idea was better. And we'll do that. And I'll also ask the table, I can't find the rule right now. How do you think we should handle this? And again, just to peel that expertise and that group experience.
Yeah, I think that gets lost a lot as well. I mean, that was a kind of a classic thing from like the TSR era of D&D, where people would write in questions like, how do I rule this? And the answer is kind of like, well, how do you think you should do it? And,
exactly.
and going that way, I think that's useful to kind of bounce it off your players, and maybe it just gets them into the mindset of what the DM's doing on the other side of the screen too, if they have to think about things like that. But so you started up the blog as a repository of tips and tricks and things that you wanted to make sure we're all in one spot. Was there any other bloggers that were kind of like, a template or a guidepost for you, or is this kind of, it just evolved naturally on its own? That's
a great question. It mostly just kind of evolved naturally on its own. Although I will say the one person I'll call out specifically, who is inadvertently responsible for the Alexandrian being what it is today, is a blogger named Seamus Young, who regrettably just passed away recently. But he ran a blog called 20-Sided. He kind of got his big name from doing a webcomic called DM of the Rings, where he took screenshots from the Lord of the Rings movies and then captioned them as comics as if there was a DM running the game for the players. Hilarious strip, well worth looking up. But he also did a number of other things on his blog as well. And at one point in his blog, he was talking about how encumbrance works in D&D. And I ended up jumping into the comments over there and talking about some like weird corner cases involving 3rd edition D&D encumbrance, which then spawned into a larger conversation about how the rules of D&D 3rd edition were designed and why they were designed and why they worked the way that they did. And that ended up being someone in the comments there actually asked me, hey, could you talk more about this? And I said, well, I'm not sure the comments are the best place, but I can write an article about it. And that article ended up being an article called D&D Calibrating Your Expectations, which was the first really kind of big, chunky, original content I'd written for the Alexandrian specifically. Prior to that, I'd been doing things like collecting reviews and stuff I'd done, and there was a few smaller things. But this was a big kind of meaty article that specifically looked at D&D 3rd edition and how you could look at what the mechanics were telling you about the game world and calibrate your expectations for like basically what level your character was and how that level equated to the scale of the fantasy that you were playing in. And it was specifically talking about the perception some people had, particularly at the time, was that like 20th level characters, rather, 20th level D&D characters are like, they're basically like Conan or Aragorn. And the reality is that if you look at the things that the mechanics tell you those characters can do, they aren't Conan or Aragorn. Conan and Aragorn are like 5th level characters, basically. You know, ballpark estimate. You can argue about the exact number or whatever. But when you come in, you say, "Oh, I expect my 20th level D&D character to behave and have outcomes like Conan and Aragorn." You get into a real dissociated place because that's not what the mechanics feed back to you. The mechanics are, and I summon meteors from the sky and drop them upon you, or I jump off a 300-foot tower and I walk away because I have all of these hit points, or and etc. And as association causes problems for a lot of people. That there's a whole article I wrote about that, but I wrote this article, and it was really important because up to that point, the Alexandrian was just a place for me to kind of put stuff and occasionally link people to, but there wasn't an audience there. And what happened with D&D calibrating expectations was somebody, I don't know who, but I'm eternally thankful for them, actually posted that article to a site called Stumble Upon, which I think is still technically around, but I'm not sure how many people
basically been replaced by Reddit at this point.
Yeah, exactly. But it went to Stumble Upon, and it hit at just the right time, and went super viral. And I went from having like a few dozen people come to the site each month to having tens of thousands of hits on the site each month. And so suddenly I had this audience. And when you have an audience, suddenly it's a lot easier to motivate yourself to like create material for the audience. And so the next big thing I wrote was an article called The 3-Clue Rule, which looked at how to design mystery scenarios for RPGs in depth. And that one also hit, and expanded the audience even more. And if not for that chain of sequence of events, from Seamus Young talking about encumbrance, to someone asking me in the comments to talk about it at more length, to the article being linked by somebody on Stumble Upon and generating an audience, my life would be completely different. And I don't know if the Alexandrian would even still exist today. And it certainly wouldn't be the place and the rich community of people, not just the work I do there, but also the really amazing community of people who have grown up around the Alexandrian, and all the amazing things that they do on the site and on our Discord server. None of that would probably exist if not for that crazy, lucky set of circumstances.
Yeah, it's funny how stuff like that can just tumbles in, and when you look at it in hindsight, you're just like, well, that's how it went. In the world of our current social media, where everybody's in different sites, and there's Discords, and there's Twitter for however long it lasts, and whatever replaces Twitter in the future, and Reddit's, what have you, blogs almost seem to have taken a step back from the prevalence that they were at one point, especially in the OSRs, but in RPG space in general. How do you think yours has held on, and what do you think in 10 years, if you want to put on your scrying hat, do you think that the common meeting place will be for folks online for this sort of stuff? What would it look like?
That is a great question. So I'll talk about the first part and why I think the Alexandrian stuck around, and that's mostly because I'm stubborn to some extent. But I think it also to some extent is that I have a very clear understanding of what the blog is for. It actually goes all the way back to the fact that the blog was there to archive these articles I had written, and there are a lot of blogs that existed that were just social media before the really in-depth social media existed. They were basically what Twitter does, but there was no Twitter, so I have a blog instead. And they're ephemeral thoughts and processed thoughts and that kind of thing. And I never really treated the Alexandrian like that for the most part. There are a few exceptions, but for the most part, like, the Alexandrian was a place for me to write articles, meaty content, and share it up there. Articles like the 3-Clue Rule or node-based scenario design or the depth crawl stuff or the point crawl stuff more recently. And so because it's this meatier content, it's kind of more like a little digital zine in some ways. where there is this archive of this meeting material. Whereas, like, if you go back in the archives of, I'm not saying about all of the blogs, but many blogs, you'd be like, oh, this is like reading Twitter posts from 10 years ago. Like, I'm not sure why I'm here, or like what relevance it still has. But the 3-clue rule, I think, for example, still has a lot of relevance to people, and new people are discovering that every day and getting something out of it. And I certainly do produce my own fair share of ephemeral content. It's just I am, in fact, doing that now on Twitter, for example. Stuff that doesn't feel like it has that permanence, I very consciously put that someplace else.
Yeah, one of the places that kind of does the archiving of blogs really well, I clammed onto it as soon as it came around, and I was just speaking with Eric from it the other day, is the Knock magazine. I love the fact that it's a physical product that takes some of these great articles from online and brings it to a physical place that I can store it on the shelf. And, when I pass away, that will still be there and somebody can take it and read it. And, the internet may have exploded by then, who knows? But have you ever thought of doing something like that? Because the name The Alexandrian is such just a really great naming as well for the blog branding. But I think that would, as you said, it's a kind of a digital zine. I wonder if have you thought about taking it into the physical space and collaborating with some other folks in the same way?
I have not so much about collaboration specifically with the Alexandrian material, but I have looked at trying to get some physical collections of stuff published and making it in a more permanent form. The main reason it hasn't happened is I'm easily distracted. There was one point where I was like, oh, I'm going to put together this collection of Alexandrian content. And then I got hired by Modifius to design their Infinity RPG. And then I finished that job, left Modifius, and I was like, I'm going to put together a collection of RPG stuff. And then I got hired by Atlas Games to be their RPG developer. And so there's just been other projects and other books coming out that have been sufficiently distracting for me to not actually get that project finished and out the door the way it needs to be. But I do live in eternal hope, and I do think that in the near future there will be a book from me about GMing and collections of articles from the Alexandria that I hope to have out there in the very near future.
You say easily distracted, but then you go off and list off some really quite impressive tasks to throw out there, and it doesn't even touch on some of the other stuff that I threw in from the intro there. Like the acting and the playwriting and what have you. We spoke briefly right before we jumped into this about how other members of your family are also kind of following your path on that a little bit as well. How do you think those other experiences, whether it be playwriting or acting, influenced how you play the game or how you approach the game or how you view it in terms of what is role playing? Everybody's kind of got a different view on that, but I gotta assume that this impacts yours in some significant way.
There's actually a conversation that I had when I was a freshman in college, and I had a teacher in college who felt it was his responsibility to get together with all the freshmen in his class and try to guide them on the course of life. There's a man named Tom Clayton, and he was teaching a mythology class. He was a mythology literature professor. And so I remember being in the office with him and him talking to me and when I was playing the role-playing games. And he was like, well, why do you do that and theater and all that? And I said, well, the thing is, and I haven't really thought about this before, but it crystallized in this moment, which I think is why this conversation sticks with me, is that I said, the thing is that they're all different ways of exploring storytelling. And I think the biggest thing is if you talk about the influences go both ways. And the biggest influence that sort of my collective experience has had is that often we talk about storytelling in a role-playing game, particularly, for example, we're talking about a situation where the GM is like, I have my story and I'm going to tell it to you now. But when I answered this question back then, too many years ago, and even more so now, is that the stories I'm talking about is the shared collective story that we create together at the table. And that feeds back both ways. How do I say this? It's that the thing I love about role-playing games is that, as a GM, is that I love creating a situation and then having the players react to that situation, then having me actively react to them. And within about 10 minutes of a session, I have no idea where we're going. Because we are both actively playing with each other. We are actively tossing the ball back and forth. I'm not handing them a ball and being like, put the ball over there. We are actively playing with our toys. And that feeds back into my theater work as well, where in theater, you there are directors who are like, you will do it my way and no other way. But the thing I love about directing in theater is the process in which the director and the cast and the crew and all the other people involved collectively create something that individually none of them could have done by themselves. It is a collectively creative process. And so I think that's the biggest thing that flows back and forth, is the different ways in which you ask questions and then get answers back, and then ask honest questions in return. And sometimes the idea of asking a question can be metaphorical, literally asking a question sometimes. But what am I trying to say there? You're not literally asking questions sometimes, but it is that it's the image of tossing the ball back and forth and seeing where that active play takes you together.
Yeah, there's been different words are hard. Aspects of theater that you kind of see intermix in with it. Not so long ago, I mean, I guess it's probably a year or two ago, a YouTuber, Professor Dungeon Master, created a train. He called it Ultimate Dungeon Train. It was kind of like this lazy Susan that he could quickly set up and tear down, but he likened it to play sets in a theater, that you didn't need to see the walls. You just need to have a couple pieces of set dressing to really invoke the area that you're in. And so you can kind of see some cross-pollination between the two. I see it a little bit where when you look at some of the ways that people share their games now with streaming, and it seems like the line gets blurred between what's a performance, what's gameplay, what's amateur improv night, what is an RPG game, and what is a production for an audience. I guess it really comes down to who you're targeting. Are you targeting just the people at the table for your game, and you're just trying to have fun together, or if you're trying to target a viewer of some sort? But do you see those lines being blurred? And what's your thoughts on how that is? Like, is there a evolution of the RPG game based off of the fact that it's now kind of being done as a presentation?
Yes, I think that absolutely does impact. I mean, it's also, you can see this in theater as well. So the place in theater that's closest to role-playing games is obviously like improvisational theater, which is often the public face that is often like comedic improvisation, right, in one way or the other. But there's only other forms of improvisational theater as well. And so it's obviously the closest place. But even within improv in theatrical environments, there is a difference in the improv exercises that you do when you are just in a rehearsal room together, and the improv that takes place on a stage. Because when you're in a room together doing improv, you are all collectively the audience. In the same way that when you're playing a role-playing game, in your game room at home, you are all both collectively playing the game and also the audience for the game. Both of those stances exist at the same time. But as soon as you bring in an exterior audience, whether that's, Acquisitions Incorporated performing live on stage at a convention, or Critical Role doing an actual play, as soon as you bring in that exterior audience, there is this additional audience that is being addressed and that you need to communicate with. Like that, if you have an audience, part of your job is to communicate with that audience and to share with that audience, and in some cases to receive feedback from that audience and to play to that audience, and that does shift play. The degree to which it's a completely different form, I think, does vary quite a bit. And maybe varies less than some of the other differences you see in, for example, the difference between storytelling games and role-playing games, for example. So there's a broad spectrum, right?
So when you've mentioned here, when we were talking, that you were playing a lot of third edition and that era of gaming, and I can see behind you a lot of the fifth edition books. What is your, and you've mentioned some other companies that you've worked for. So what if you're going to reach for a game, is your criteria for picking which game you're going to do, and then which games do you find yourself reaching for more often now?
Well, that's a really interesting question. I think that one of my biggest insights or changes from when I was younger. So if you asked Justin in the '90s this question, he would have said the RPG I'm going to reach for is Big Eyes Small Mouth Second Edition, super flexible game, can use it for almost anything, and that was the way Justin in the '90s kind of thought about games. Is that that there would be there would be the role-playing game that is closest to my preferences that will satisfy my role-playing needs. And I think the biggest thing is as I've gotten older, and wiser may be a bit of a stretch, but older anyways, is that I have switched towards more thinking in terms of role-playing games in the same way I think about board games. Like if you're talking about board games, for example, you would never be like, well, the one board game I'm going to always reach for is Betrayal at House on the Hill. Like whether I'm looking to play Catan or Monopoly or Captain Sonar, Betrayal at House on the Hill is the one I used to run my scenarios with. And that's just, of course, not the way board games work, or even video games, right? Like there's not even within video games, it's like that. You would be like, well, when I want to play Halo, I reach for Call of Duty. Like you play the game that is what you're looking for. I think the same thing is true in the role-playing game and storytelling game area as well. Increasingly, is that what I'm looking for is the specific game that's trying to do something interesting more than anything else. So like recently games I've reached for include like Blades in the Dark. I love the things Blades in the Dark does in terms of having structures there for the players to build a crew of criminals doing their criminal thing, and then having the individual heists and jobs that those people are doing feed back into that system as well. Very creative. A storytelling game I've reached for recently is Brindlewood Bay, which is a game which can basically be described as Murder, She Wrote plus Cthulhu. But the mechanical gimmick is that the mystery scenarios in Brindlewood Bay don't have a solution. They're just a collection of clues that you present to the players, and the players know this, and so the players know that they are in fact creating the solution to the mystery. And then there's a mechanical structure that determines which solution is the correct one for the story that you're currently telling. And so it's that kind of thing. I'm looking for games that I guess have a point of view and are actively trying to do something specific, and then I'm looking at, and then it's like, and it's like picking a book or going to a movie. It's what I'm in the mood for right now.
Right. I love the fact that you called it Captain Sonar. I love that game. I've got the, sorry, I'm looking over my shelf trying to see where it's at. I've got there's a smaller, so Captain Sonar, for those who don't know about it, if you don't, go look up this board game. It's fantastic. You have a bunch of different people that are all acting as crew members on a submarine in different stations, but there's a smaller version just called Sonar. That's really good for like 2 to 4 people. If you enjoy Captain Sonar, go look up the game just Sonar. It's made by the same company as the same game in many ways, but done in a format that's more suitable for 2 to 4 people. And it's pretty cool. Anyhow, I love how it seems lately almost all these conversations I've been having with people, board games leaks in, and that's great. That's because I'm also a big board game fan as well.
But I'll check out Sonar. I just had the recently very satisfying experience that I first came to Captain Sonar and learned about the game in late 2019 and bought a copy and was really excited about playing Captain Sonar.
And then where do you get that many people at once?
Right. Well, and I'd actually scheduled a session where I had the 8 people for Captain Sonar. It was going to be great. We were going to play, let's say, about March 24th, 2020.
And something happened?
Something happened that didn't happen. So then it was like 2 years later that I finally managed to get a group together. This was just a couple months ago. I finally managed to play Captain Sonar for the first time. And a fantastic game. Looking forward to playing it again, hopefully sooner than 2 years from now. So
yeah. Both games, Captain Sonar is because of the number of people that are there. It's a very different experience because you've got it's a lot more hectic with that number of people. Sonar it feels like an advanced version of Battleship with some cool mechanics built into it. So yeah, people should definitely take a look into those. You mentioned that you've gotten older, not necessarily wiser, but you've gotten older. You and I are roughly the exact same age, so it seems kind of weird for me to ask this question, but you've produced a lot more in your lifetime than I have. If you had to stop everything right now, what's going down as the legacy? What would be the item that you're like, yep, nailed it. That's what people are going to look back at. And it doesn't need to be from gaming too, because you've done outside of that as well.
I mean, if I was looking at realistically what it would probably almost certainly be the 3-clue rule, which is that, as I was talking about earlier. And the idea behind the 3-clue rule is that for any revelation you want the PCs to make in a mystery, you need to include at least 3 clues for that revelation. And if you design your mysteries that way, with sort of a robustness, a redundancy in those clues, your mystery scenarios will generally work. 90% plus of the time, as opposed to failing 90% plus of the time. And I think if there's like one enduring idea that would probably stick around, it would probably be that specific essay. I think people would still be passing that around years from now. And I say that kind of based on empirical evidence, which is that when I look around the internet today and see what people are doing, the number one place where the Alexandrian comes up most of the time is someone being like, how do I run a mystery scenario? And somebody says, oh, you should read the 3-clue rule at the Alexandrian. I know that's just me hyping myself, but like, I guess the question was inherently asking me to hype myself. So I think that is, so I think realistically, even if the Alexandrian disappeared tomorrow, there would be somebody who had saved that article, and 10 years from now, somebody would be like, how do I run a mystery adventure? And they'd be like, here, let me send you this PDF of this web article from 10 years ago that some guy wrote.
Yeah, it's interesting how often the same conversations stay around for ages. I went on a dive there, I don't know, a while back now, where I was going through as many old RPG magazines, Dragon, Dungeon, White Dwarf, all these different zines from back in the late 70s, early 80s, and just kind of reading through. The articles were interesting, but what I really found interesting was going through the letters to the editor and reading through those, and seeing the questions and the topics that were coming up from people that are so the exact same topics and questions that get brought up today. So yeah, I think you're completely right, is that a lot of this content is evergreen, because as people cycle in and out of the hobby, they're always going to have these same questions and the same, not understanding quite what they want to do, but it sounds cool, so I've got to find somebody who can teach me. So yeah, I think you're bang on with that this content will always be relevant in some way. You've got a game, so we mentioned game design as well at the top. There's a game that I saw on your website that I hadn't heard of until I went back looking at your website to just brush up on everything before we had the conversation. Can you give me the elevator pitch for Magical Kitties, and what that game's all about?
Magical Kitties Save the Day. I can. Yeah, so Magical Kitties Save the Day is a game that was originally designed by Matthew Hansen, and then Matthew and I and Michelle Nephew worked together on the second edition, which is published by Atlas. And Magical Kitties Save the Day is a game where everybody plays a magical kitty. Every magical kitty has a magical power, and every magical kitty has a human. Now, sometimes the humans think that they own the kitties, but that's obviously ridiculous. Humans can't be trusted with kitties. So kitties love their humans, though. And the problem is that every human has a problem, and the kitties need to use their magical powers to help solve their humans' problem. But what makes it more complicated is that the kitties and the humans all live in hometowns together. And those hometowns also have problems. They have problems like witches and hyper-intelligent raccoons and alien invasions. And all of those hometown problems make human problems worse. So the magical kitties need to first deal with the witches and the hyper-intelligent raccoons and the alien invasions before they make their humans' problems worse. And in some cases, that's how they need to solve their humans' problems as well. And so that's the game in a nutshell. And then on a larger level, the game is really designed specifically to be a game that you can use to introduce new players to role-playing games. Particularly, like when we think about what our primary audience for it is primarily parents who are looking to play their first role-playing game with their kids. Because the subject matter is there, the whole game is designed around that. And then the other thing I really wanted to make a point of with the second edition of the game is to not only have it be something that can be your first RPG, but they will also take that player who's played an RPG for the first time and then give them the tools to become a game master for the first time. And there's a number of ways we do that within the game. So one of the cool things about the game is that, so the second edition comes in a box. And as soon as you open that box, one of the things you'll find in there is something called Magical Kitties and the Big Adventure. And Magical Kitties and the Big Adventure is a choose your own adventure graphic novel. And so it's a comic book, but you play through it the way you would with a choose your own adventure book, but with the mechanics of the game. So by the time you finish that choose your own adventure book, you will have learned the rules of the game, created your first kitty, and gone on your first adventure. And so it's not exactly the same thing as actually playing a role-playing game, obviously.
Speaking of magical kitties.
Speaking of kitties, I think she's meowed right into the microphone there. This is Kira, my magical kitty.
You mean this is Justin?
Yes, this is
Kira's human.
Yeah. So you can play through that, and then at the end of that, you have a character who's literally just a character from the game, and you're ready to go and play your first adventure with this kitty who's already gone on an adventure. And it's not designed to be the same thing as it's not the same thing as a role playing game, obviously, because it's a solo play. But that's kind of the beauty of it, is that you can give Magical Kitty Save the Day as a gift to someone who's never played role playing games before, and they can open that box and they can have this first experience, and within 15 minutes of opening the box, have a little taste of what the game is. And that's something I think is missing from a lot of role-playing games. Where, like Captain Sonar, you have to spend a lot of effort to pull together that first group and to see what the game is like, and to get a taste of what that's like. And so we really wanted that to be like, if you imagine giving the game as a Christmas gift and having it under the tree, I want to have a kid who can open that box and be like, oh, this is what this is about. Not like, oh, this is cool, I'll have to wait 3 weeks before I can actually see what this game is. And then the other thing we do in terms of that transition to Game Master is I took a lot of the material we've developed over the years at the Alexandrian in terms of game structures and scenario structures and how to prep material, and I boiled those down into what I refer to as adventure recipes in the rulebook for Magical Kitties. And the idea behind there is that the adventure recipes are very simple, step-by-step. Do these 5 things and you will have a workable adventure. One example of this is with mystery scenarios. So it's a very simple recipe where I say, okay, you're going to have 5 scenes. I come up with 5 locations, and we have like hometown supplements where you can actually just go pick 5 locations from those hometowns. In each of those locations, you're going to put 3 clues pointing to other locations in the very specific pattern. And then, take a couple of bad guys and put them here and here, and then you'll have an adventure. And the recipes are great because they are not the same thing as telling you exactly what the content of the adventure needs to be. The goal is to have a recipe that gives you a structure that is kind of guaranteed to work, but you can pour any content into that structure that you want. Very much like a classic dungeon in D&D, where if you follow the old school instructions for how to make a dungeon, you have a number of rooms, you key content to those rooms. You can pour any content you want to into those dungeon rooms, but the structure of the dungeon is robust and simple to run. And as a result, you can have an infinite variety of dungeons while still having that surety as a first-time GM that the adventure isn't going to break horribly or be difficult to run. And that's kind of our goal with the adventure recipes.
Yeah, that's something that does get missed from a lot of books. So for the 10 billion different OSR BX clones that are out in the market, one of the things that a lot of people lament about quite a bit is the fact that they don't have the example of play. A lot of them don't have the example of play in them that the actual BX books do. And so I've got my choice games that I prefer of that genre. But I often tell people that if they can, go pick up the PDFs of just straight BX, if for no other reason than for the learning how to play the game parts of that book are so well done and there hasn't really been a whole lot of people that have duplicated that well. So it sounds really cool that right off the bat you get to do a solo adventure and learn a lot of that stuff. Because I think everybody's read through the examples of play and went, oh, I can see the personality of these people in these situations. And so being able to play it out in a way that isn't just reading a book, you're actually doing some play is really cool.
I was actually heavily influenced by Frank Menster's version of BASIC, the 83 red box set. Because there actually is in that book, when you open it up, there actually is a little choose your own adventure that you get to go on in that one. And that was the game that got me into role playing. And I think it worked specifically because there was this little taste of oh, this is what this is about. I get it now.
Yeah, the being able to, I think you kind of nailed it earlier when you said that when a kid opens it up at Christmas or something and they're sitting there and they look at their parents and they're like, look at this cool thing. And if the parents are like, yeah, that's great, but we've got to go make Christmas dinner and we're going to do this and this. And if the kid doesn't have a brother or sister to play with right away, they can go off and play by themselves. I think that's a really, really smart way of approaching that, and being able to use the product right away is really good.
I was actually talking to some friends of mine. I have a 6-year-old daughter, and so I was talking to some friends of hers who had heard I designed the game and went and bought copies. And one of them was like, "Can you run the game for her?" Because I've never done a role-playing game before and I have no idea what I'm doing. But his daughter had actually read through The Big Adventure like 20 times, just over and over again. Because she didn't have anyone who could run the game for her. That was the only way she could experience it. And so that was really like, oh, well, this is in fact working. And then she was really excited when they came over one day and actually got to play the game with an actual game master. So
yeah, it's funny how not just for kids, it also applies to adults, but for definitely for kids, when you change the scale of the game down to animals. So I've played different pseudo versions of D&D with, I've got a 7-year-old son, and I've played different games with him. Some he bounces on and off of, and other ones, but one that really hit home with him was Mouse Ritter. And it not only did he engage more with the game, but it also, Mouse Ritter seemed to have solved his murder hoboism. I've said a few times before, because he suddenly realized that he was small and he was small in the world, and just a scale change. And I think making things furry and an animal probably helps as well. But giving different sorts of problems than maybe what an adult would look at when they're trying to think of an adventure, making the problems, about a cat trying to solve their human's issue, I think it's a different perspective that is really good for kids in that standpoint.
Well, I think it's one thing I've observed about Magical Kitties Save the Day is that Magical Kitties Save the Day has a number of different hometowns in different places, and they can get pretty fantastic. Like we have one that's like the kitties are taken to Mars by the first colonists of Mars, and the game that becomes about like building the colony with the humans. And there's another one where you go to the magical realm of Fantastica where all the fairy tales are real. But a lot of the hometowns, the default expectation is that you'll be playing in like a real world town where you happen to be magical kitties. And it becomes a very interesting mix because being a magical kitty is very freeing because there's magic and you're a kitty. And so the kids don't feel like they have to try, like that is unique. And so they don't have any like hesitation about, am I doing this right? Well, I'm a magical kitty. Of course I'm doing it right. But having that real world at the same time kind of lets them, like, it doesn't ask the same thing as like a full-fledged typical D&D session, where oftentimes, like with younger kids particularly, they haven't seen Lord of the Rings or read a Conan book or dived into Wheel of Time or the like, and so they don't actually have those touchstones. But the real world they get, and they understand what kitties are, and they know what magic is, and so that's a real easy access point for them.
I've got a couple more questions for you, and then we'll wrap up. But one of the questions is when you go through your writing process, whether it's for the Alexandrian, for play, for just your own personal consumption, what's your process like? Are you I carry around a notebook and a pen? Are you mostly on the keyboard? Are you in the shower and you've got the dry erase marker trying to keep it? What is your process on it? How does that work out for you?
Yeah, so generally speaking, what I have is I have a notebook that sits on my bedside table because I do a lot of reading in bed, and that's so like reading, whether it's game books or nonfiction books or fiction books, reading tends to be the place where I generate a lot of new ideas, and so I'll make sure I have a notebook handy where I can write those down. If I don't have a notebook handy, I will abuse my email inbox by opening up an email and sending myself an email just so I don't lose track of that notes. I mean, the biggest thing as a creative is that you learn that ideas hit you at any time, anywhere, But if you don't write, and so often, like, you know, you think to yourself, oh, well, this is such a cool idea, I will never forget this idea. But if you don't write that idea down, it is going back to the same place it came from, which is away and into the ether of creativity. So that's the biggest thing I've learned. It's just like, wherever the idea is, record it somewhere. And you may come back later and be like, I don't know what Eggplant Salad Cats was about. I'm sure it seemed genius to me at the time, but it isn't anymore. And that's the worst case scenario, right? You can always just ignore past you. So that's one thing, is like the tons of notes. Now, in terms of actually like what's involved in the actual prepping or creative process, I do that almost entirely at a keyboard. That's just, you know, when I was younger, when I was very young, my dad brought home an IBM XT computer in the 80s, and I've been typing ever since. And so I type very fast, and a lot of my creative thought is through word processing. And sometimes you'd be like, what fancy programs do you use? I'm like, I use a text editor in Microsoft Word, and that's like how I organize most of my campaign stuff, is actually just literally folders full of Microsoft Word documents, which may be partly because of some young traumatic experiences of like using more specialized programs, and then people stop supporting the specialized programs, and then all of your data is stuck in a specialized program that doesn't work anymore. Whereas I have pretty high confidence I'll always be able to access these Word documents.
That's something that I think more people need to take a pause on. I mean, not to knock on any of these products that are out there. There's fantastic world building tools and brain mapping tools and whatever you want to call them, right? All these big note taking tools. But you really need to look at, you know, how easily you can get your stuff in and out of said product, and whether or not it's an online service that you know, could just disappear one day. I mean, I rely way too heavily on Microsoft OneNote, but it is a software that's installed on a machine, and I can easily get items in and out of it. The program I've been trying to love it has been Obsidian, and I will maybe eventually move my way there. But yeah, I mean, just having plain text in folders there's always going to be something that can read it, and you know, making sure that, you know, you can come back and the archiving of things, like we were saying, the reason you've got the blog to archive things, the reason why I like the print material is so that it can be found later on and not just be lost to the ether, because there's been so much stuff that has just been gone away. Behind you, there is a giant map, and the people that are listening to this can't see it, but I definitely can. And I've been curious to ask you. I wanted to ask you before we started the show, and I forgot before I hit the record button. But yes, I will now ask, what is the giant map behind you? And
that is a giant map of Waterdeep in the Forgotten Realms, actually. I first printed that out. I was running the Dragon Heist campaign for 5th edition, and the digital files for that campaign came with a giant poster-sized map. And in this case, what you're seeing behind you that the audience can't see is in 7.5 foot tall vinyl printing of the Waterdeep, and I printed that out for my Dragon Heist campaign. I really like, particularly for urban campaigns, having a map of the city hanging on the wall of the playing space, so that the players can see the city there. And I'll actually have a laser pointer, and I will use a laser pointer to indicate like how they're traveling through the city and where locations are at. I think it's just a great way of I find it to be a very immersive way of engaging with the city at the table.
So when you're playing, are you a person that that relies a lot on maps and minis and battle maps and that sort of thing? Do you draw out like the areas that you're in, or are you more of a theater of the mind, and which end of that spectrum do you find yourself playing on?
This really comes back to some extent to what we were talking about earlier in terms of like believing that different role-playing games can be different things, right? Different experiences. And so, for example, I have a long-running 3rd edition D&D campaign set in Monty Cook's Tolus that has been running since 2007. And I've always used battle maps with that. I have a Chessex battle map that I lay out. I've done large diorama pieces. There's actually one adventure for Tolus that involves a huge technomantic tower that's actually like 10 stories tall, and I actually ended up building that tower 10 stories tall. It stood about 8 feet high in the gaming space, and all the minis could be on it. There's actually an article on the Alexandrian with all the files I used to print out and build that. So people want to build their own 8 foot high, 10 story high Technomantic Tower, you can do that by jumping to that article. So I will do that kind of stuff for that game. But like with 5th edition D&D, for example, I've run a few 5th edition D&D campaigns, and I've done all of my 5th edition gaming actually Theater of the Mind. I've just found that to be just to be the way it kind of fell out and feels kind of natural to me for 5th edition. I know there's other people who'd be like, how on earth are you running 5th edition without a bunch of minis? But I actually find, for me personally, like 3rd edition has rules that seem to really reward some of the precision of the battle map, and 5th edition's rules don't seem to have the same reward to them. But I've also run 3rd edition games with Total Theater of the Mind. I used to run every October, I would run a 3rd edition version of Tomb of Horrors that I had done a remix on, and we would always do that Theater of the Mind without a battle map on the table. So it varies a lot, I guess, is the very short and also very long answer to your question.
No problem. All right, two more. One is because I've seen you discuss it in the past on the blog. Star Trek or Star Wars? This way I can get at least half of the world angry at you. The thing is, all of my answers to your questions are, well, see, at different times, different things are good. And there's some truth to that. So when I was growing up, I was a huge Trekkie. There was a point where one of my biggest dreams in life was to write a Star Trek tie-in novel. And this was in the days before the internet even really existed, and there were no wikis yet. So when I was a kid, I actually, my dad would actually tape the episodes off of TV. And so we had like all the TNG episodes. And there was one summer where I just watched Star Trek episodes. It's time it was original series and TNG were the only two that existed. But I just watched every Star Trek episode that ever existed, and I had a notebook. And I would, for each episode, I would have a note page. I would just take notes on continuity, like biographical details of the characters, the way the ship worked, and everything. Because like I was like, if I'm going to write a Star Trek tie-in novel someday, I have to know every single established detail so I don't contradict it. And that made a lot of sense to me when I was like 10, 11, 12. Later on, I would learn that even the actual writers don't actually care as much as 12-year-old I did about the continuity of where the Jeffries tubes on the Enterprise are. But or like what Picard's childhood dog's name was, or whatever the heck it was I was writing down back then. So I was a huge Trekkie, huge Trek fan. But I've also always been a huge Star Wars fan, and they both kind of tickle different itches for me. I have essays on the Alexandrian talking about the ways in which George Lucas uses Campbellian myth cycles in really interesting ways. And like, not just like, the easy thing about it is like, oh, well, he just uses the Campbellian myth cycle. But the prequels are actually a really fascinating set of movies, despite their many, many flaws, because he's not just doing a straight up Campbellian myth cycle. He's deliberately subverting it in some key ways with Anakin's story that I find to be really fascinating. So the answer is going to be, I like them both, just so that nobody gets angry at you. Okay, I see how it is. Yeah, won't plant a flag.
Okay, I'll say this. I will go here. If you said today, in terms of particularly new content that was being produced, it's 100% Star Trek, and it's 100% Star Trek for basically one reason, which is Strange New Worlds, which is the Christopher Pike series that came out last year. It is so good. It's so good. I remember watching the first episode, and I was kind of like, oh my goodness, I'd forgotten what good Star Trek looked like. So 100% Star Trek right now. Because at the same time last year, my experience with Star Wars was getting 2 episodes into Obi-Wan and being like, I think I might be done with Star Wars for a while, and not finishing that series. And
my caveat on this whole thing, I have not yet watched Andor, so I know there's a massive Andor fan base. I have not seen it yet, but I 1000% agree with you on Strange New Worlds. I am one of the few Trekkies who I kind of on original series Star Trek. Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, all those were totally my jam, but original series, but Strange New Worlds, it's like, oh, if they would have made this was
My experience with the original series is really interesting because, so like I mentioned, my dad was a Star Trek fan before me. He was the one taping them off of TV back in the day and introduced me to the show. And the way he introduced me to the show is back then there was a Columbia Video would release the TOS episodes, 2 episodes per tape, per VHS tape back in the day, and you had to buy them individually, and they were ruinously expensive. like $25 per tape in 1980s dollars for 2 episodes. And so my dad, though, knew that about 2/5 of original series Star Trek is in fact some of the worst TV ever made. And then there's another third of the series which is pretty good, and then there's like another third of the series which is like some of the best TV ever made. And so my first exposure to TOS was not the 2/5, which is complete garbage, the Apple, Spock's Brain, that stuff, because he never bought those tapes. Like, he wasn't going to spend money on Spock's Brain. He knew it was terrible. So like my experience with TOS was just for a good long while the third that was like the best TV ever. So like, right. And if that had been the only thing they made for TOS, like if TOS was entirely the balance of terror and City on the Edge of Forever, that would be the best TV series ever made. Didn't quite get there. But that's when I think of TOS, I just think of the third that's the best ever, because that's the stuff I watched over and over again when I was a kid.
I went through the whatever happened to be on TV on the reruns. So I got...
That's a real crapshoot.
Yeah, it's a big roll of the dice there. All right. So the last thing I always ask everybody on the podcast is, you have undoubtedly been on other podcasts and other YouTube channels, and you've spoken with lots of different people. And I'm sure every time you go to sit down for one of these, you've got a question in your head that you're like, okay, if this person asks this, I got the answer. And maybe that question never comes up. What is something that you wish people had asked you about, or that you would like to talk about that nobody ever comes up because they don't know this side of you or something like that? What should somebody be asking Justin that he would just love to go on about, and use this as your opportunity to do so?
Boy, that's a tricky question. Partly because I have my platform where I get to pontificate about anything I want to pontificate about in the Alexandrian. So there's usually not anything like, oh, I got to talk about this because like I've already talked about it. Like, or if I need to talk about it, I can just write an article tomorrow about it. So I mean, something I'm particularly passionate about that has absolutely nothing to do with this podcast is Shakespeare. I'm a huge Shakespeare buff. There are articles on the Alexandrian about Shakespeare, because like I said, the site it was originally more about just like anything I was interested in archiving. I ran a Shakespeare theater company for a while back in the day. And Shakespeare's just great. I love Shakespeare. I don't know. That doesn't seem like something people should actually ask me about on an RPG podcast per se, but
I don't know. Everybody seems to really like grounding, generic fantasy land in older style English, mythology of sorts. So, I mean, there's definitely connections there. Are you of the opinion that from a scholarly perspective that he wrote all of those, or is there other people that have, plastered his name on it?
Yeah. So Shakespeare wrote his own plays, and I feel very strongly about this. And here's the thing: like here's how this debate often goes. And people answering this, there's actually a really great book called "Shakespeare in Fact" by Irvin Mattis, which is a great summary of the authorship debate, quote unquote. But the way the authorship debate always goes like this is: the person who says, "Well, Shakespeare didn't write his own plays," always starts by saying, "Well, we have no evidence that Shakespeare wrote his own plays. No contemporary evidence from his life that Shakespeare wrote his own plays." But then if you actually read the article, if you actually read into the arguments, they have to qualify that, and they qualify it by saying there's no contemporary evidence other than his peers saying he wrote them, the reviewers of the time saying he wrote them, also all the books published with his name on them that say he wrote them. Other than all of that, and also the legal records of like the plague houses and the actual royal court recording him as being the author of the plays. Other than all of that evidence, we have zero evidence that William Shakespeare wrote his own plays. And you're like, well, why are we ignoring all that? Well, that's because of the vast conspiracy that was trying to hide who really wrote the plays. Okay, great. Well, who do you think wrote the plays? And they'll say Francis Bacon or Queen Elizabeth or what's the Earl?
Aliens.
Yeah, or the aliens wrote it. But they have some other candidate, and you're like, well, what evidence do you have that they wrote the plays? And they're like, suspicion. And they're like, okay, so you don't have their names on anything, you don't have legal records at the time, you don't have reviewers or contemporaries, you just have Well, and the one I was like, well, yeah, but this guy has like some of his life story is very similar to Hamlet. And you're like, do you think Stephen King is a clown? Like, is that a thing that you think that authors only write? Do you think Gene Roddenberry actually went to the planet Vulcan? That's not how any of this works. George Lucas does not have a working lightsaber.
Oh, that's disappointing.
It is disappointing, but nonetheless true.
If Shakespeare was a...
Oh, that this too solid flesh would melt, thaw, and resolve itself into a dew, or that the everlasting had not turned his cannon against self-slaughter gods. Gods, how weary, stale, flat, and unprofitable seems all the working of the world to me. 'Tis an unweeded garden that grows to seed. Things rank and gross abuse it merely.
These...
So you sit down
I'm sure you're able to, because you've explained it.
Or
you're a big fan of it,
room, or
and I just love hearing it because it's something I can't.
That was
do.
not.
Can you quote out
your favorite
for those who couldn't see? Besides
of his,
how well it came across, there's got to be one. But he was
okay. Well, you may
visually as well. So how are you rehearsing those?
Generally speaking, the place I rehearsed a lot when I was performing Shakespeare, a place where I had to do a lot of my rehearsal of Shakespeare was actually the front seat of my car on commutes, because I would learn my lines driving the car, and practice them there, and then of course in rehearsal itself. So so no mirrors, just working with the language. It's one of the things I love about Shakespeare. It's just I love working with language, and he's of course a master of language and is able to communicate so much through so little sometimes.
I know so many people that do the same thing for practicing a voice or an accent for an NPC that they're playing in a game. Is they use their commute time, their big box of solitude that rolls down the highway to get through all those. So again, more connections between the two mediums that are ever intertwined. Where can everybody find all of your stuff? Obviously, there is the Alexandrian, but is there other places people should look for you?
So you'll be able to find a lot of the links to the things I'm about to list on the Alexandrian. So if you remember one thing, just remember thealexandrian.net. But you can also find me on Twitter at Hexcrawl is my handle on Twitter. I also do Twitch streams once a week. We do something commonly called Random GM Tips. So people can just join up there and chat and ask questions, and I will ramble on, hopefully in a semi-useful manner. I also have a YouTube channel with a number of videos on there as well. And then also my Discord. The Alexandrian Discord is a really fantastic community. There, I tell people, if you want to come there for me, that's great, but you should stay for everybody else, because this is a really rich community of DMs showing a ton of interesting resources and discussions about role-playing games, about GMing, about game design. It's really just, I'm humbled by the fantastic people who are part of that community. I feel like there's something else I should be mentioning as well, but I think that covers the bases. Oh, I have a Patreon, which is also actually a really good place. Even if you don't want to support the Patreon, you can always follow the Patreon, because I post updates about like when upcoming Twitch streams are coming up on there as well.
So you've worked for a few different game companies. Is there any gaming products or any game books or anything that you have either in the works that you're able to talk about, or stuff that has recently come out that you want to?
Well, we already talked about Magical Kitty Save the Day, which is what I'm always telling people you should check that out. But we actually have coming up at Atlas Games, we have a Plangea, which is a 5th edition, which is a Stone Age setting for 5th edition. And David Somerville, who's the primary designer on that one, his approach to doing Stone Age fantasy is really fantastic. I've seen a lot of Stone Age games over the years of being in the hobby, in the industry, and most of them always take the form of like, well, it's the Stone Age, so you can't have this, and you can't have this, and you can't have this. And David's approach with Plangea was the exact opposite. He said, I want to have everything in 5th edition in the Stone Age. So anything you can do in 5th edition, you can do in the Stone Age. But then the Stone Age also lets you, ride a Triceratops, struggle to invent language, and so you can do all these kind of cool things that you can't do in a normal D&D game, but make sure everything you can is in there as well. And settings, it takes place in the of your familiar esque fantasy, but it takes place in an epoch where the planes have not yet separated from each other. So like there's a central place called the Blood Mountain, and everything's being pushed out from the Blood Mountain. And on the edges of creation, there's like what will eventually become the elemental planes, for example. But you can just walk to them because they haven't actually separated into separate realities yet. The world is still primordial in that sense. And so everything is still trying to like find its place. The elves still live half in the dream world, so they often appear sort of semi-translucent in sunlight. The dwarves are fresh born from the mountains, and so they still have like chunks of crystal and rock, and their hair is often made of some kind of like mineral growth down their back. So there's this wonderful kind of evocative primordial imagery that David's found that really gives the setting, if I may say so myself, a really unique and big impact punch to it.
Awesome. All right. Well, I will link all the different things we've talked about, but like you said, the main place to go to is the Alexandrian blog, which is how I first ever heard of you and how, I keep going back to it for various items. So thank you very so much for starting that, continuing it, growing it as you have. It's a fantastic resource. May it ever stay online, and hopefully maybe come out in a print format at some point as well. I think that would be great too. But thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me. It was really a pleasure to speak with you and get to know you. And I hope everybody, goes and checks out the games. Hello Kitty. That's a different game altogether. Magical Kitties Save the Day sounds fantastic. I will probably grab a copy of that as well, just for the same reason that you mentioned. Great for kids, and go from there. So thank you so much for talking with me today.
Thank you too.
All right, folks. Everything you need to know about Justin and the Alexandrian will be linked down in the description of the episode. I hope you were entertained, you sat back, you listened, you enjoyed, and you learned something. And most importantly, I hope you are eager to come back for more. www.theredcaps.net has all the links to all the ways to contact me, and I would love to hear from you. It is getting close to the holiday season, and no matter what you choose to celebrate, I hope you get to spend some time with family, that you end off this year of 2022 with a good note, and I wish you all the very best going into the new year. Stay safe, have fun. We'll talk again soon.